Senator Sampson, how are you this afternoon?
I'm doing great, Stephen. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate you coming on. When the governor first made that announcement last week, I was kind of taken aback by it simply because it's longer than I've heard any other state talking about doing. It's also, I'm, in my opinion, a little premature as we don't know what direction things are going. We're seeing some really good signs out of so many of these different hotspots. And to push out this shutdown for another 6 weeks just arbitrarily without, it seems, no hope that he's willing to give in on this is got to be frustrating for so many people.
I couldn't agree more. It's actually really funny how it worked out, Steve. I had sent a letter to the governor last Monday, I think, which was April 6th, asking him to at least acknowledge that the actions taken by his state government are having an impact on our economy, and we've got to start looking at how we're going to proceed with a recovery at some point. And I made a bunch of suggestions to him. I sent a list of things that he ought to be doing. First and foremost, I really enjoyed listening to you speaking with my friend Carol Liebau, the discussion about how every state employee is still being paid full boat. They're getting their full pay and benefits, and the taxpayers are still funding their pensions. They're lined up to get these raises, and the state government has taken no hit whatsoever. But yet the private sector, who funds the state government through our taxes, is expected to continue paying those bills. It just doesn't seem fair. I had also asked him to do things for people that are in a situation created by the government, which is businesses that were deemed non-essential and were told that they have to lay off their employees and they have to close down. Well, those people should not be experiencing an increase in their unemployment insurance rates. So I asked him to address that. And what happened was either Thursday or Friday, whenever this happened, I learned that he included that in his executive order, and I started writing him a note thanking him and saying, gee, Governor, I really appreciate the fact that you took some of my advice and you incorporated this. And it wasn't 30 seconds later that someone said to me, oh, and by the way, he's also extending the closures till May 20th. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And I guess my reaction is the same as yours, which is, first, I think it's debatable whether or not the state government has the right to dictate who's essential and who's not essential, and also to determine business closures. I don't know that they have the right, but if they do, it ought to be done with some sort of common sense approach. Look, the governor has no idea what the effect of the virus is or what the world is going to look like in 2 weeks, let alone 6 weeks. So why is he putting a date so far out in advance? I would have been much more pleased if he said, look, we're going to extend it for 2 more weeks and then we'll look at it again. That made a lot more sense to me, and that's what I told the press. But I got to tell you, Steve, I'm so shocked at the reaction that I'm getting from a lot of people who just they think I'm the villain here because I want to see us operate in an intelligent way to move forward. I have not told anyone that they shouldn't be social distancing. I haven't told anyone that they should not be doing everything in their power to prevent the spread of the virus. I believe that with my whole heart and being. The thing is, I don't believe the government is the necessary answer to our problems, or that the government has to issue an edict for us to do things that are common sense with respect to one of your earlier callers.
Well, and it's been fascinating to watch, like you say, how do they decide what's essential, what's not essential? I mean, I just saw a story on CT Capitol Report that says the governor of Florida, the Republican governor of Florida, by the way, has said that the WWE is deemed an essential business. I mean, these decisions are just being made like they're throwing darts at a dartboard.
Yeah, well, even Governor Lamont, the very first day that he did the business closures, he did restaurants for takeout and closed bars altogether. And then I guess people came to him and said, hey, by the way, there's a lot of other industries where people are right on top of each other. So he comes back a few days later to close hair salons. It's like, did you think about any of this?
Yeah.
And the thing is, when he first did that, my phone and every other state legislator in this state, their phone immediately began blowing up with people asking questions. Well, what are we going to do? I mean, when are we going to go back to work? How are we going to get paid? How are we going to pay our employees? What are we going to do about our light bill? What are we going to do about our property taxes? I get all of these questions. And, of course, there were no answers. And that's the frustrating part, is that when you have an executive that is given this power, this immense power to make these grand decisions, but they don't even think them through all the way. The thing with the rental assistance, which to me is an absurd way to refer to it, since the state government is not assisting anyone. They're essentially telling landlords, well, guess what? You're going to have to absorb the fact that we're telling tenants they don't have to pay rent for the next 2 months. That is not renter's assistance. And that doesn't benefit the landlord, and it doesn't benefit the tenant, because the tenant's still going to owe their rent 2 months from now, and now they're going to be multiple months behind. It's just bad planning. And I would just love to see people take smaller bites when they're going to exert their authority like that, and more thoughtful bites.
Well, now I know you, and I know you're probably one of the most conservative members of the state legislature. You are a firm believer in all 10 of the Bill of Rights, and any attempt to sort of restrict or rescind those rights, you are always pushing back against. And this, one of the things that has bothered me about this is just how easily people went along with this without questioning anything. You know, when they sat there and cherry-picked which businesses could open, which businesses could close, like you said, hair salons. I bet hair salons could limit themselves to 2 or 3 customers at a time. I bet if you left them open, let them stay open, there's things they could do, like wearing masks, wearing gloves. I know they're going to be in close contact with other people, but we see the same thing at the grocery stores and at the big box stores and at the liquor stores. All of these attempts to restrict business just, again, doesn't seem to be making any sense to me. And especially when you look at, many of these small businesses, they don't have huge crowds in them on a regular basis. They are open all day. They may get 1 customer, maybe 2 customers at a time. But this is their life's blood. This is how they make their money. And to restrict those small businesses while allowing so many of these large businesses to remain open, as though there is no way we can mitigate the risk in a small business, I think it's really unfortunate.
I completely agree, Steve. To your point, this is the problem with central planning. The governor of the state has an extensive background, but I don't know that background translates into understanding how every individual, small business, large business, and person is operating in this crisis. And that's the problem. So you cannot write a policy that is arbitrary that affects every business in the same way. You can't say that every liquor store is the same way or every retail store is the same way either. They all vary. And to your point, I believe that the American people are smart enough. And of course, to the larger point, which is that that's not how our country works. In America, the people hold the power. Governor Lamont and President Trump, they are not our leaders. They are responsible to us. The people hold the power. They decide what they want to do. And I believe the government's role in this situation is simply to provide them with the information necessary to make good decisions. I think that people should social distance. I think that people should try and stay at home if they can. But they should do that voluntarily. And when other people want to go out and take risk, that's up to them. I know it's a difficult thing because people seem to think that the government has a role to play to prevent anyone from going out there and taking their own risk, because they translate that into somehow affecting their risk at some point down the line. But sadly, that's the danger that is associated with freedom. And when this country is founded, the people that founded it recognized that freedom was more valuable than anything, and that if people left to their own devices could determine and assess their own danger and risk and make their own decisions based on it. I believe business owners are smart people, and they will adapt to this situation. I will tell you that on the very first day that the business closures began, the governor closed down restaurants and bars, like we said. And then he said, we're going to come back and talk about non-essential businesses. And they set up this program through DECD where you could apply to be an essential business. And I heard from a guy who owns a huge printing company somewhere in the state. I don't want to call him out because we went back and forth with DECD a bunch of times. But this guy, you don't know how hard he worked to remain essential. And what's funny about it is that this person was so proactive. We're talking like in the middle of March, before this ever got into a big thing. He had taken his entire sales floor staff, which were all in like cubes 5 feet apart, and he actually moved half of those people into the warehouse next door so he could spread them apart. Came up with new protocols for people who come in and out of the building. Just came up with a whole plan for social distancing to operate his business under the threat of the virus, but to still function, keep jobs, and allow things to continue. This is what we need. And this is how we are going to go about reopening our state and our country eventually, hopefully, by empowering people to be intelligent and make those decisions on their own.
Now, as you see these orders being extended, and then you read that the governor's popularity is increasing. He was at a very low position before this started, and now his poll numbers seem to be going up. I mentioned this earlier, and I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but it almost seems to me like he's being rewarded for making these decisions. And I know human nature. You know, if he's starting to think that people like him for what he's doing, he's going to keep doing it.
I completely agree. I mean, it's a real shame. And I hope that when this is all over, we get our country back, Steve, because you were talking earlier with some of the other callers about some of the various, somewhat isolated, although growing in frequency kind of issues. The city of Meriden actually just came out yesterday and said they're going to start using drones to patrol the parks to make sure people are social distancing. I mean, this is madness. It's complete madness. The fact that a group of people want to go to the park together does not affect the other people that don't. And the state, in my opinion, has no right to restrict anyone from their freedom of movement or any of those things. And I get that. And probably people are screaming at the radio right now that I have the nerve to suggest that people would do things that are so risky. But this is America. It's a country based on freedom. And our government does not have the right to take those rights away from us under any circumstances. And, if you look at this virus objectively, it's a real thing. And I don't want anyone to think it hasn't affected me either, because it has. I know people who have died from the virus. I know people that are in ICU right now struggling for their lives. It is a legitimate thing. I don't want to get it. I've been social distancing. I'm very concerned about it myself. But at the same time, I recognize that I'm not the boss of anyone else. One of your earlier callers talked about the hubris of a man who wanted to go and not wear a mask while getting on a bus. Well, it is not the right of any of us to tell anyone else what is right for them. That's what hubris is.
I was thinking about this after that call, and I was thinking about this during the break, too. We tell people they have to wear clothes. I mean, if I wanted to walk around without pants, I couldn't do that. There's laws, and that's a restriction on my freedoms. You know what I mean? Hello? I know you're laughing at this, but
I don't even know how to respond.
Well, that's it. I mean, we do allow for some restrictions. He was right in that point. We do allow for some restrictions on our perfect freedom. We can't just have anarchy. We can't have perfect freedom. But I do think that there's opportunity to express the inner tyrant that many people have here. They're reveling in it. They're enjoying it. And I mean, when you have married couples who are being told by police they have to stay away from each other and not hold hands while they're going for a walk. These are the very same people that more than likely sleep in the same bed together at night. But if they're out in public and a cop sees them, they're going to get a talking to at the very least. And that's where we've lost our minds. People should be able to...
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, it's a slippery slope, as you described earlier, and that's what I'm afraid of. And the thing is, I started to say a moment ago that if you look at this objectively, the numbers of people that are affected by this virus and the ultimate number of fatalities is going to be relatively small on the scheme of other things that happen. You mentioned the flu. The number of people that die of lung cancer, for instance, or heart disease is significantly more every day. And yet we're not restricting other things that are obviously harmful for people. I mean, the government continues to make a fortune on sales taxes on cigarettes. And I've always questioned that. Why are you continually raising the taxes on cigarettes? Well, that's because you know that people are going to continue to smoke and you still want that money. But at the same time, those same people are arguing that cigarettes are so terrible. And I ask them, I say, well, why don't you ban cigarettes if they're so terrible? It's a similar situation here. And the concern is that people are rightfully fearful, but I believe that certain people in politics are taking advantage of that fear to impose this kind of draconian policy that is not well thought out and they really ought to be more concerned about protecting their freedoms in the process.
Well, because as I've said here before, once you give these freedoms up, it is very hard to get them back. People will not be so willing to return these freedoms if they can so easily take them from you.
I completely agree. I mean, at some point, is there going to be a situation where you'll have a legitimate case because someone came to work with a cold? Because essentially, that's what we're teaching people right now, is that the government has an obligation to keep us all safe in all places, no matter what, including the public, which has always kind of been the realm of the uncertainty. Obviously, we have a government, we have a police department, we try and maintain a sense of decorum in the public. But when you enter the public realm, you do that with some element of risk because you cannot control the behavior of every other citizen. And that's a place where you're not secure, like in your own home, on your own property, where you are the king. When you go out into public, you are essentially going into a neutral territory, and you don't necessarily have the obligation to dictate other people's behavior. And that's where we're coming unraveled, is that it's starting to be a situation where we are empowering the government to control people in that public realm beyond what was ever known before.
We're speaking with State Senator Rob Sampson. I want to kind of shift gears with you here a little bit. We know that the legislature was shut down, about a little over a month ago?
Right, something like that.
Yep. Now, there is the end of this session would have been, May 6th, I believe, correct?
That is correct, yes.
There always is legislation that has to be brought forth in budget fixes during this shortened session. There's certainly always an attempt to bring up some bills that maybe didn't get a good hearing in previous sessions. But there's a problem brewing here, and it's another one of these issues that, I'm going to be talking with former Senator Markley, your friend, on this tomorrow. It's that there's a call to sort of bypass almost the entire legislative process and just say, look, we threw all these bills out there for consideration. Let's just put them all into one big bill and vote on them, yes or no, and then they all either go through or don't go through. And I think we all know what would happen there, especially with the overwhelming Democratic majority, is every single thing that they wanted to do. Even Pat Sasser wrote on, I think it was on Facebook, Pat wrote it on Facebook, that is this how they get tolls through? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a perennial problem, obviously exacerbated by this particular situation, but it seems to happen every year. When budget time comes around, there are various pieces of the budget where there is, a lack of agreement, and people end up having to have the pot sweetened for their benefit to earn their vote. And I just feel like this might be an opportunity for the majority to try and move a whole bunch of agenda items all at one time if there is some sort of limited session as a result of the virus. So it's a legitimate concern. I don't know how legitimate it is right now, and I can promise you that if they start talking about that and it becomes looking like a potential reality, I'll be sounding the alarm. I know that people, regardless of their political party, do not want to see that happen. And that's the one advantage that we have, is that I think that even Democrats will recognize that that's wrong. I think most people, if they understood the process happening in Hartford on a regular basis, the way they emergency certified bills, the way almost every bill that comes out of committee, where the average person would think that's where we work on the bill to fine-tune it and get it right, that when they hit the floor of the House or Senate, in every case, the first thing that happens is someone will do what's called a strike all amendment, which is essentially striking a bill that exists and replacing with something entirely different. It's like, isn't that what you were supposed to be doing in the committee, was fine-tuning the bill? There are lots and lots of bad practices that happen in our state government in the legislative process. And that could be the most worst thing that you can think of, is a case where they get their entire wish list jammed into one giant omnibus package. And we've got to keep our eyes open and make sure that doesn't happen. Yeah,
I mean, there's one of your compatriots there, Senator Will Haskell, is already called for that he just thinks that that's the way to do it. And it's like, wow, you need a little more experience under your belt there, sir, before you make comments like that, because this is how bad laws get passed.
Yeah, well, Senator Haskell looks at our government as if the government is the source of power, and that they have the right to make decisions for the people. And I just don't look at it that way. That's not the American system of government, like we were just talking about. Power comes from the people, and the representatives are responsible to them. And, you've got to represent all of your constituents, and not just the ones that you agree with. You've got to respect the rights of everyone, including the minority. That's the whole point of our Bill of Rights, as you well know. I'm really scared about what is going to happen going forward with our legislative process. I think that there are too many people, in both Republicans and Democrats, looking the other way as the governor continues to, what I see, exceed his authority. This rental assistance thing, by the way, is a huge example of exceeding his authority. The governor is granted certain powers under this emergency, and essentially he can affect any statute, but it's limited to things that have to do with public health. I don't know what the private contractual agreement between adult citizens regarding their rent, landlord and a tenant, they're two adults, they make a private contract between themselves. I don't know what interest the state has in that under any circumstances, but now we're going to say they have the governor can do it essentially on his own without legislative approval and affect that agreement. And how does that relate to public health? I don't think it does.
So there are things that need to be passed. There are fixes that need to be put into place. We were looking at a budget deficit anyway of about like $170 million or something like that needed to be addressed. There were certainly a couple of other things that really had to be addressed in this shortened session. What's going to happen with those things? Is there going to be a special session called after this pandemic is behind us, or are they going to maybe talk about maybe using technology so that you can all debate and make your voices heard and maybe even vote? I mean, don't those things have to be done? How are they going to get done?
Yeah, your guess is as good as mine, Steve. I have no idea what's going to happen. The legislature was essentially set home and shut down over a month ago. The governor's been making all the decisions. I don't know that we have any policy on the books. Maybe the governor will try and create one that allows us to vote remotely. I think that's a bad policy no matter what, because I think you need to be in the room to have a conversation. And particularly if you're going to be offering amendments and changes and, that kind of thing, I think there's a purpose for being in the same place at the same time when that happens. As far as a budget deficit, you and I have talked about this before. They build a budget deficit into every budget they pass, which is why I haven't voted for a budget since I've been in the legislature, outside of the one budget that actually was the Republican version that passed a few years ago until Governor Malloy vetoed it at the time. And that's because they essentially create a budget knowing full well that the following year there's going to be a deficit. And you ask yourself, why would they do that? And the answer is because that gives them an excuse to come back in, create yet another budget document that they can fill with a lot more things that are not beneficial to the state of Connecticut. And it's an excuse to raise taxes yet again. Oh, look, we have another budget deficit. We've got to do something.
Well, that's my fear after this, because, look, they've already suspended the 10-cent per bag plastic bag tax, which I think is just hilarious on its face. Once they, the arguments against it were there and in public, and people were talking about this, and it still got through. But now all of a sudden, in the face of a pandemic, whoops, we have to pull that one back. So many of those little things are getting exposed. But the tax revenue to the state has dropped off dramatically. And so this small budget deficit we were looking at could very easily turn into a huge budget deficit very quickly.
Oh, it is day by day. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I mean, dollars are symbols of wealth, and wealth is the result of production. And when you don't have businesses operating, nothing is being produced. So wealth is certainly not being created, and therefore there's no dollars to pay for things. The federal government is in the process of doing this massive $6 trillion bailout thing, and there's talk of more. And that essentially is going to do one of two things. Either they're printing more money, which devalues the existing currency, effectively taking wealth from people that have already produced it, or they're just borrowing against our future. And that's what concerns me more than anything about those types of plans. That's not to say that there's not some benefit to the economy for trying to maintain the flow of money. But at the same time, I think it's dangerous because you're hurting the money supply. And ultimately, all of these policies result in the same thing, which is the people that actually have produced wealth or are the hardest working among us, the ones that are actually generating the value every day that is used by our entire society, are the ones that will be penalized the hardest for the benefit of those that are not contributing as much.
Well, Senator Sampson, I hope that you are successful in getting the governor to see through or see clearly on this shutdown and extending it out to May 20th. As we see in the news, there's been some very good news coming out. And, of course, obviously we don't want to jump the gun on this, but making a decision that at the time was 7 weeks, or now we're still looking at 6 weeks, without even taking into account that there could be a whole different situation in just 2 weeks.
I totally agree.
Is very.
I'm sorry.
I was going to say, just very short-sighted, in my opinion.
Yeah, completely. And it shows, the fact that he came back just a couple of days after announcing this May 20th date to decide to create this 7-state, 21-member committee with other states to determine, a plan forward to reopen the economy. I just want to point out, the people of Connecticut did not elect those 21 people to make those decisions. And they did not elect the governors of the other 6 states to be involved either. They elected this state government and this governor to make those decisions for Connecticut residents. And I think people should be concerned about that.
You make a great point. It's why I was talking with Chris, my producer, about this earlier. It's like, it seems it's so easy to put together a committee because then nobody's responsible for the answers that committee comes out with. It's just a real simple dodge to say, well, I didn't want to do it this way, but they overrode me. We all agreed. And no. You're in a position to make these decisions. This is your job. If you don't want your job, well, then there's the door, It's just and
there's a real danger in a situation like this, too. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of very important medical experts floating around, Dr. Fauci, right there standing by the president and, various other experts on the state level and that kind of thing. There is a real danger of the people that are elected to be responsible to their constituents transferring too much authority over to those individuals. Essentially, that's what the progressive political movement is. It's the idea that there should be this government bureaucracy of experts that should be making decisions for the people and keeping the role of the elected people as limited as possible. And we have signs of it already. I mean, in Connecticut, we have PURA, which is the Public Utility Regulatory Authority, which essentially is, responsible for determining, electric rates that are acceptable, managing the cable companies. In recent days, I've been hearing from loads and loads of constituents concerned about their cable service. And of course, the legislature has nothing to do with this anymore. The legislature transferred all this power over to the set of, bureaucrats that, they're going to have their jobs no matter whether they resolve the problem or not. And that's what concerns me about this new business opening recovery commission. Who are they accountable to? Because they are so separate from the voters.
Well, I'm glad we have you out there keeping an eye on this stuff for us and coming on and kind of letting us all know what's going on. And hopefully when we get back to saner days, we'll get back to saner decision-making. But because it just seems to me like at this point they're all just shooting from the hip. And look, I've been really trying very hard not to criticize anybody in the decisions that they're making here, because I know there is no playbook. You can't just pull something off the shelf and go, oh, okay, this happened, this is what we do. No, there is no playbook for this. So everybody's kind of flying as best they can, but for the most part, blind. But I think we also have to realize and recognize that the more power and the more rights they take away from people, the more difficult it's going to be to get that back. And if they're, and you can tell some of these people seem to really be enjoying this opportunity. And that's a dangerous precedent to be setting.
I couldn't agree more. And, I've approached it the same exact way. I have been working with my colleagues in both parties, and I've been working with the governor. Each day we send him a list of concerns, and thankfully they get back to us trying to resolve as many of them as they possibly can. And I agree. It's not a perfect science. During this interview, I probably said things that are probably much more bold than I may have said in the last 10 years of serving in the legislature. And the reason why I'm doing it is because I think it's so important that people at least remember the principles this country was founded upon, We have drifted so far, far, far from them that they sound shocking to a lot of people today, and that's unfortunate. I want to empower people to recognize that this country was founded on the notion that every citizen is like a king or queen themselves. They get to make their own decisions about their own pursuit of happiness. And the government's job is supposed to be super limited. It's supposed to stay out of our way to do things. And yes, there is risk associated with that. And that's the balance that we've been fighting all along. Risk and safety versus freedom. This has been discussed throughout history. We all want safety, but you have to decide what freedoms you're willing to give up in exchange for that safety. And I think we've drifted far too far in that direction, at least based on the circumstances before us today. And I just want people to recognize that there is value in freedom, and hopefully they don't lose sight of that.
Well, you sounded really close to Benjamin Franklin quote there, where, those who are willing to sacrifice liberty for security deserve neither. That's kind of a paraphrase of it, but that's where we stand at this point. We've trained the population to believe that life is risk-free and that we should all be perfectly safe from harm at all points, and that's the government's role. And that's just couldn't be further from the truth. So, State Senator Rob Sampson, as always, sir, a pleasure. Look forward to having you back, and continue to stay safe, all right?
I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks, Steve. Keep up the good work.
All right, Senator, take care.
Good work.
All right, Senator, take care.
Good work.
All right.